All right. Hey, Liam, good to see you, man. Welcome. It's actually episode 20, right? Because I think I just saw that we
Yeah,
posted
we
episode
couldn't remember the
19.
number last time, but
Yeah, yeah. So it's good to be back on a Thursday. Can you believe we're already in July coming up? It is freaking crazy.
yeah, yeah.
We've got two topics. We've got two topics in mind today. We're obviously going to talk about what happened between Israel, Iran, and the U.S., the impacts that has. We'll also talk about Project Operation that I think has been kind of hidden under the rug for quite some time. Operation Ajax, excuse me, Operation Ajax, um, and the impact that had on the Iranian government back in the 50s. You know what the future looks like based on what we've seen over the last week. We also want to talk about privilege in a discussion that I had on a live this past week, and kind of pick your brain about what does privilege really sound like when you're trying to educate people? Does it always sound like you're coming from a place of privilege when you're sharing information? Because I fell into that situation this past week, and it's resonated with me the last couple of days. Not to mention any content creators, because I always want to, respect their space. But I thought it was interesting when I went up to share some information that it I thought it backfired, and I was told that I was coming from a place of privilege and to be cognizant how I broach certain situations. So nonetheless, I apologize and shared that that wasn't what I intended. But I think it's a good discussion to have. Are we getting overly sensitive on certain topics? Not all, certain topics, and I want to be cognizant when we do enter spaces like that, especially our audience who's listening. When you enter a space that talks about various things like classism versus racism, privilege versus non-privilege, you know, and many other things that don't come to mind right now. But I'm sure as we unpack this discussion, they will. So Liam, let's what I'll do. I'm going to flip it to you to talk about. I think taking us back to 1953 under Operation Ajax and the ramifications that's had on the Iranian government, and then we'll just go back and forth. But yeah, I know you brought it up before we started recording. Talk to the audience a little bit about Operation Ajax. What was that intended to do? What happened there? Who was involved, and what was the outcome?
okay, yeah, that sounds like a fun place to start. I was actually going to ask you, do you want to start with what happened in the current conflict first, and then go back, or go backward first? So let's just do it chronologically.
Yeah.
Um, there are okay. So what got me going on this, and you said you saw this clip too. I saw a little excerpt from an interview that because people take those little clips and put them up on the social media. I
Right.
saw somebody I did not expect to take a take like this. A fairly establishment liberal figure like Joyanne Reed actually calling out what the U.S. had done to Iran to create the current government.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that we really just do not understand. What stood out to me more in that clip was it's not just that, hey, it's interesting to see an establishment figure actually talking about something like this at all,
Right.
but it was the canned rhetoric from the other side to say, well, they're just like radical jihadists, and like they hate America, they hate our freedoms, and like, are you fucking kidding me? No one should have fallen that for that with George W. Bush.
Right.
Freedoms. I mean, no one should have bought that shit, but people still do, and here we are decades later. The oh god, and the jihadist line too. Just so people understand, okay, and no shame in any of this because it's not common knowledge to people, and honestly it's one of the things that complicated the whole Iraq war was that Americans have no idea that there's different types of Muslims in the world. I mean, never
Yeah.
mind the Sunni Shia split. Who the hell knows anything about like ibadis or anything else? But I mean, okay, Sunnis and Shias are very different critters with very different interpretations of Islamic law. The jihadi movement is entirely Sunni. It's just not connected to the Iranians. The Iranians don't send out like the so-called suicide bombers anywhere. It's just not a thing. There's no
Right.
attempt at a caliphate. The caliphate oppressed Shia people. One fun historical anecdote that I think is useful to a lot of people, because this comes up a lot in really shitty rhetoric that you see online. People will talk about like, oh, those Muslims, they're always liars. Takia, they always lie. They always lie. Like, well, the concept is actually a Shia one there that says you can lie to Sunni authorities that you're a Sunni so the Sunni don't kill you. This goes back to the Middle Ages when they were actively persecuted. They don't like the caliphate. There's no history of getting along there. So why the hell would Iranians want to support a global jihad for a caliphate? But
Right.
that kind of ignorance just blows my mind, that we just can't address it. I really want media to do its job and inform people. And unfortunately that falls to folks like us to try and help out.
Yeah, I don't think we can ever get it from Western governments to get that granular. Because the reality is, and I would use a different term to describe Muslims, not critters, right? But I would say, just in Christianity alone, I mean, you have your extremists, right?
Yeah.
Truly, and that is the case in every religion. But I think part of the issue, the Islamophobia that's so prevalent, stems, I think, from what happened in the 90s under the Iraq war, Desert Shield, Desert Storm. I think that all fostered that Islamophobia, and it's our job to remove it from the narrative. Just like we talk about anti-Semitism and how that there's an increase there, we don't talk about what's the cause of Islamophobia. And I think understanding the differences in the terminology behind the faith is essential for people to say, all right, this is not what the Western media has portrayed all these years. And I think we talked about this also. The last point I'll make is, like, in theater, in entertainment, you always see, whether it's the Arabs, the Muslims, they're always portrayed as the villain. And so we have to change that narrative. And so I'm glad you brought that up. But Joanne Reed's comment about what happened in Operation Ajax, I think, is an important call out for the first time, and not many people talk about it. The only other person I heard talk about it was, I think he was either John Mearsheimer or Professor Sachs, one of the two. And so talk about that a little bit. I think that's an important kind of historical context to kind of tee us up on today's conversation.
Yeah, and that shift too. And honestly, just as a quick side note, since you mentioned Islamophobia, this is something that we really should pay more attention to.
Mm-hmm.
And it is functionally identical to anti-Semitism. And it serves the same basic nationalistic and imperialist purposes. The main uptick in it began during the 1970s, when the Cold War began winding down, and we needed enemies to justify the military industrial complex and our position around the world, and hundreds of military bases and everything else. You had to find some other ways to do that. And there's a massive uptick in propaganda about the Middle East in the 1980s. And a lot of what we saw in the 1990 Gulf crisis, and then later in the aughts with the Gulf Wars and whatnot, all of it builds on that legacy. It all builds on that demonization that begins there to create a useful enemy to justify empire. So let's back up and talk about empire. Suggesting here, there are three key periods that give us the current situation that we have with the Iranians, and that the Iranians are stuck with their government. The first actually goes back to the late 19th and early 20th century, in the late Qajar dynasty. So like the last imperial house before the Pahlavi Shahs.
Okay.
And at the time, Iran was basically a failed state. It had no functioning central government. Different parts of the country were controlled by warlords. Ever since the collapse of the Safavids in 1722, people had struggled to have a unified government holding the entire area of historic Persia. And the Qajar state focused much more on making themselves rich and selling out the country in a way. One of those places is oil. They signed a deal in like 1908 to hand over control of all of the oil in Iran to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which becomes BP eventually.
Yep.
And if people don't know BP, that they run the Arco stations, all kind of stuff. It's a huge global fossil fuel company. But the AIOC was set up because of that, because
Mm-hmm.
of the easy access to it. And the deal they got was they had to turn over 16% of the profit to the Shah, and that's it. So not of gross, not of anything else. They get to pump the oil out, refine the oil, sell the oil. 16% of the profit goes into the hands of the ruler so he can live a nice, cushy life. And again, this is a deeply incompetent government. I mean, they were basically selling jobs. Hey, you're totally illiterate, but you want to be my finance minister, whatever. Here, just give me a bribe. Like, they didn't have an ability to run a functioning government at the time, so they needed the cash, and this was the sellout.
Okay.
Flash forward a bit.
Right.
People kept trying to revise that order. The government had changed. The Qajar dynasty was gone. They're trying to like modernize. They're modernizing rapidly in the 20s and 30s. A lot of the basis for modern Iran as a people again underestimate the degree to which Iran did effectively modernize, but how far back it was, because it didn't go through the long periods of substantial development of the 19th century that gave us a lot of other nation states. It didn't go through the 19th century reforms in the Ottoman Empire that created modern Turkey. It was left behind there and it had to start over in the early 20th century. So it's running to catch up, right?
Right.
In the process of that, they're like, yo, bro, can we have some more of our oil money? Because like it's ours and
Yeah.
we need it to like, I don't know, fix agriculture and build roads and, you know, all that kind of shit here. Can we have some more of that money? And Britain's just like, nah, we kind of like the profits and you signed the deal, so you're stuck with it.
Right. This was what year again? Remind us of the year.
The period here, so the sellout of the oil industry is beginning of the 20th century. It's okay. Oh, actually, no, it's a little before the so like 1903. Yeah, 03,
Okay.
I think. So at the beginning of the 20th century, you've sold out the oil, and major reforms begin in the 1920s with Reza Khan, who becomes Reza Shah. So like the last Shah of Iran, his father.
Okay.
The guy who ends up being a bit of a Nazi, right? But he's trying to like emulate what's happening in Turkey and trying to modernize the country, because at the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Turkey starts, you know, aggressively modernizing, you know, doing all this stuff. And they're like, hey, we're going to do the same thing. And they're like, hey, can we have some more of the oil? Those arguments continue through the 20s, 30s, 40s. They're just like, can we please? And at no point is anybody willing to play ball with them. So the vast majority of that oil wealth is just flowing out of the country to support global empires. This is one of the reasons when we talk about European imperialism, you know, a lot of the world was actually conquered outright. Like whole areas fell under the control of European countries, right?
Mm-hmm.
But other parts didn't. They fell into what we call like spheres of influence or like indirect control. So like China and, you know, Oman and in Iran, like places that weren't directly colonized but were de facto colonized. This is the factor here. There are foreign troops in the country. There's foreign control over their assets, and
Right.
their assets are being used to fund imperialism around the world. Oppo's a little loud. You can hear that, right?
I can hear it. It's okay though.
Oh yeah, got a loud parrot. He really wants to be in the show right now, and he's sort of out of rank. Hello, Oppo.
We'll bring him in. We'll bring him in when it comes to the discussion on privilege.
I think we talk to him every now and then. He'll keep a little more quiet.
There you go.
But yeah, they're demanding a bit more of a share of their own wealth and being denied that. And that's the context for the nationalization that'll create Operation Ajax that you mentioned.
Yeah, and I do want to give people a little bit of timeline because you mentioned, you know, you're spot on. So BP, British Petroleum, that's what we're talking about, originally known as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, APOC, began oil exploration in 1908 and production. So in 1901, British entrepreneur William Knox D'Arcy was granted a concession by the Persian Shah at the time, Muzaffar al-Din Shah al-Qajar, to explore oil in Iran, then Persia, for 60 years, by the way. Then in 1908, oil was discovered in Masjid Soliman in southwestern Iran, the first significant oil discovery in the Middle East. Then at that point, 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, APOC, was formed to develop the find. This company would later evolve into BP. And so that's your timeline for what Liam was talking about. Again, 1901, 1908, 1909, to eventually where APOG evolves into BP. And so from 1909 on, there was development of oil or mining of oil. Then something shifted in the landscape. Do you want to continue from 1909? Or do you want to get to Fight 53 and what happened there? What are your
Yeah,
thoughts?
there's a short interregnum we kind of need here in between, in the 1940s, because there's a significant global event in the 1940s. It's
Oh, you mean World War II?
Yeah, and Reza Shah was kind of a Nazi fanboy and was perfectly willing to work with them, trade with them, and part of that is just the enemy of my enemy kind of stuff, because
Right.
Germany hadn't been the imperial power, Britain and France were, so it's the other side of that, and part of it was that they could hitch their wagon to the racial ideology that Germany was using, because ultimately, as soon as you start talking about like Aryan peoples, Aryans, I mean, Aryan is the origin of the word Iran. Like
Mm.
that's the it's part of like this earlier Indo-European history on the steppes that ultimately created a lot of European languages, a lot of Indian languages, and the Persian languages, all ultimately connected. So like, hey, we like that BS. So during the war, we overthrew the government, and so Reza Shah was toppled, and his son Mohammad Reza Shah took power,
Mm.
and he agreed to rule as a constitutional monarch. And in the later 40s and into the beginning of the 50s, that government continued to evolve and become more and more democratic. So a lot of the
Mm.
early authoritarian features of his father's rule, like the vetting of candidates and that kind of stuff, this guy can't run, like all that was sort of dropped. It became more directly democratic and more
Right.
effective. And he was kind of like taking a back seat, kind of like a lot of the European monarchs were at the time, not really interfering in the politics. So you have a democratically elected government that's actually running things. And that's the government that decided finally to nationalize the oil.
Yep.
We tend to connect that to Mossadegh, and that's honestly kind of unfair to him because he wasn't prime minister at the time it was nationalized.
Mm.
But he became prime minister and he inherited the mess and had to try and deal with it. And the Western media, because this is also the Cold War, there are
Mm-hmm.
Cold War period, any nationalization is just like, pinko commie scum stuff. Like you can't do that. Like that's like the Soviet thing. You can't do that. So everyone's trying to paint Mossadegh, who's like a moderate liberal, as some kind of like flaming commie because he's having to negotiate. Because when nationalizations happen, you open up negotiations with the people who own the assets. Like, hey, cool. So we're going to take over AIOC, all their assets that are here. So the refinery at facility there, all that kind of stuff there. But we want to compensate you for that. We want to work out a payment for that.
Mm-hmm.
And Britain pretended to negotiate while they worked to try and overthrow the government.
Mm.
Now, this is before the 1956 Suez Crisis, which is when Britain finally had to learn the hard way that it couldn't act like the old imperial power it was in the 19th century. It couldn't go around overthrowing governments wherever it felt like it. Um,
You
so,
mean they got checked?
yeah, and really because of the Cold War,
Yeah.
like because in 56, Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt jointly in order to because Egypt is nationalized the Suez now, so different nationalization. And in that context, the Soviets and the Americans both sided with Egypt because of the Cold War, because to do otherwise risked a significant war.
Right.
The Soviets were backing Egypt, and because Britain's a NATO member, we risked going to war. So the US is like, hell no. But it's not like we were a fan of nationalizations. And you can see that in the case here just 3 years earlier in Ajax, where a
Right.
nationalization led to a direct US intervention. And that's largely because the Soviets didn't have the same influence there. The left had been effectively sidelined. There was a lot of opposition to that, and um, there was no real threat of Soviet intervention. They didn't have a history of arms sales or major economic connections, that kind of stuff. Like they had some stuff, occupation during the war in the north, things like that. But it's not at the same level.
Got it.
They
I do want to
worry about that yet.
I do want to give some historical context to Reza. And again, this is just kind of giving you guys a little bit of background on who this person was. So, and what he was involved in or what he contributed to. So, um, Reza became the Shah. He was appointed prime minister and became the Shah in 1925, replacing the Qajar dynasty.
First one, yeah, yeah.
Yep. And so it's important to note that he was involved in building railways, notably the Trans-Iranian Railway, factories, roads, and secular schools.
Mm-hmm.
And Liam, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. Established a modern army and strengthened the central government. He was also involved in secularization and westernization, reduced the power of the clergy and religious courts, introduced Western-style clothing laws.
Yeah, they actually banned the fez and mandated for a while, like it became so closely associated with the regime. It's like a French design, but they called it the Pahlavi cap from the family there.
Yeah.
I had to wear these build hats.
Yeah, and he also, and this is interesting because he included the mandatory unveiling of women. Okay, they called it kashf al-hijab, meaning take off in public. Changed Persia's name to Iran in 1935 to reflect the country's pre-Islamic heritage. Also was responsible for nationalism, as we talked about. Promoted a strong Iranian national identity centered on pre-Islamic Persian history and education. Established secular universities and reformed legal system along French and Italians. Now, here's his downfall, and I think you mentioned this: his alignment with the German government, right? And he was forced to abdicate his title during the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran. Was replaced by his son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And then eventually died in Johannesburg, South Africa in 1944. And so, all that telling you that the kind of historical timeline for him, and then his son Mohammad Reza Shah takes over, and then you continue to talk about nationalization of the oil, and then eventually how the U.S. under the CIA and MI6 couldn't tolerate the nationalization because they had no control over the oil. Yeah. Greed. So
want to make sure that
go ahead.
We don't make him because the elder Reza Shah did a lot to provide a foundation for the modern nation state of Iran, but did so using what we tend to call authoritarian modernism, just like Kemalism in Turkey, which meant it was a lot of like top-down mandates, and it tended to alienate a lot of people. The veiling is one of those. Part of the justification for this was because of European homophobia. They decided, well, we got to stamp out homophobia. Homophobia must come because of homosociality, i.e., women hang out with women, men hang out with men. So let's force people to mix and unveil, and that will just instantly solve everything, and gay people will go away. So it's a fundamental misunderstanding,
Right.
and it ended up causing a lot of suicides. Even
sounds ludicrous to me.
There were a lot of there are a lot of women who were like forced to like accompany their husbands, like their husbands were military officers. They had to come to things and they had to like come and be on their arms. And it was so much of a radical change for people that it was hard to deal with. And a lot of the long-term effects of that, I still see pictures all over the time. People are showing like photos. Oh, look, this is Iran in the 60s and 70s. And look, it's people wearing in bikinis and stuff. Like, yeah, right. That's like some upper middle class people, like in Tehran, not most of the country. It's changes like that. They have to happen a little more slowly. When they're forced, they tend to lead to backlashes, and that will be one of the downfalls there. Oh, you mentioned the name. Just people know it's actually forcing a change internationally. Internally, it was never Persia. Persia's a Greek word, but we tend to call countries words that come from our own language, like I don't know, Germany, right? I mean, the "j" sound doesn't even exist in Germany. It's Deutschland. Right. But we call it Germany from the Latin Germania, and we still call it Germany. We haven't like changed there. The Iranians actually said, nah, bro, if you call us Persia, we're not going to talk to you anymore. They like forced it. and that's actually part of that Nazi connection, because he wanted to emphasize internationally their Aryan credentials.
Ah,
Is
okay.
yeah. So the name is important in that sense. But it's just
It's a
like
good
just changing where it is on the map for us.
it's a good call out, and it's important if I could just take a moment kind of to break down his timeline for the audience. And so the younger Muhammad Reza Shah was born 1919 and died in 1980, and was the last Shah, king of Iran, ruling from 1941 until 79, till the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which ended what's stated here 2,500 years of Persian monarchy and ushered in the Islamic Republic. So
Oh
born
God, that was there's so many fun things about that. Like they had a in the 1970s they had a big like 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire that, oh my God, people were laughing about, because there's no consistent history of monarchy.
yeah,
There just isn't. It's just saying, hey, there was one way back when, and then there have been a few other ones here and there scattered around, but there's no continuous lineage of this. But all of that too, the discussion around it, it's part of a growing Iranian nationalism, a sense of themselves as a distinct people in the world with distinct contributions to world history, and quite honestly, they do. Some of the basic features of what we understand as monotheism evolve in Iran first, right? And then end up blending into Mediterranean cultures and taking us in different directions philosophically, helping us to reinterpret the Bible in different ways. A lot of portions of the Bible are older, but they're not understood the way we understand them now until contact with the Persians. There are some very distinct contributions they've made in world history. And trying to emphasize that under both of the Shahs, the elder and younger, ends up providing a lot of the foundation for the sense of pride that can be like due to empire, that ends up being important here, because when Britain refused ever to negotiate with them, they finally said, screw it, we're nationalizing the oil. And that's a bridge too far, because A, it threatens the profits, B, it plays in a Cold War rhetoric.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to walk through that, because you bring up some good call outs, and even in his early reign, he was overshadowed by the foreign powers. It seems to me that there was a stranglehold, because he faced intense political tension, especially with the prime minister Mossadegh, who nationalized Iranian's oil in 1951, ending British control of APOC, or BP at the time. And then, which leads us to Operation Ajax in 1953. The CIA and MI6 orchestrated a coup to remove Mossadegh and restore the Shah's full power. So after the coup, the Shah returned from exile and ruled as an absolute monarch. And so the Shah returns, rules as a monarch.
He goes from being a constitutional monarch to then taking direct power.
Yeah.
Some of the resentment around that led to so thinking about mention one thing about the U.S. Let's put us into there, right? Because we've got Britain as a long-term history in the area. They've been, building Iran since the 19th century. But what about the U.S.? The U.S. was actually historically a good guy. We didn't have the same taint. We were not a major imperial power. I mean, we had colonies, but it wasn't the same history in the area. And during the 1940s, there were American advisors there. This might appeal to you with the banking history. We sent over financial advisors to help them create a functioning central bank and reorganize things economically, to sort of balance the budget, afford investment, whatnot in different areas. And what we tended to suggest to them was, you got to fix things like agriculture first. You got to start low and fix stuff like that. And what a lot of people felt on hearing that, this is an attempt to hold us down. This is an attempt to keep us a peripheral economy. You just want us to sell agriculture in the world. You don't want us to have factories and do all the stuff that you're doing. So there's a lot of simmering resentment that's growing there. But American advisors are actually genuinely helpful at this period. It doesn't really start to shift until that Cold War context. And then when Britain loses its assets in the nationalization, a lot of their agents were thrown out of the country. They couldn't do what they wanted to do. And they turned to Eisenhower and said, bro, can you overthrow Iran's government for us? And we said, sure. CIA is still there. We can do that.
Right.
And a lot of that is just pure resentment of like anything that could look remotely socialistic. We blamed the Tudeh, which is was a leftist movement in Iranian politics, and said, oh yeah, they're going to open the door up to like communism, and then Stalin will take over and it'll become part of the Soviet bloc, blah, blah, blah. We have to stop this any way possible. Which you've heard like the domino theory.
Right. So is that the start of the US's policy of overthrowing governments? Because I don't recall, or I don't know, not that I don't recall. Obviously, I understand there was an occupation of Japan at the tail end of World War II once things were settled, I think until 1951. But is that the first time we were really engaged in overthrowing a government? Because that sets the stage for.
Sadly, no. But
what would you reference?
Very early significant step. You had right at the tail end of World War II, direct U.S. interventions in Greece and in Italy. Because in both cases, the Greek partisans, who were mostly aligned with like communist and socialist elements, they fought hard against the Nazis and were super popular. And we backed fascists who had collaborated with the Nazis and helped them to suppress and crush and kill those partisans after the war. So we basically armed a far-right civil war in Greece immediately after World War II. And then in Italy, we didn't have to go that far. We basically just screwed up their election. They were holding elections after World War II. There was a referendum that said, we're going to abolish the monarchy and be full republic. And now we're going to run elections. And same thing. The communists fought really hard as partisans throughout World War II and were never tied to the old regime, where a lot of the conservative elements were. So they were set to win. And we went in and rigged the election to make sure that Italy didn't go socialist.
So why after defeating the Nazis collectively, do we go back and back them to suppress the partisan group in Greece? Why take that action?
That is honestly a topic we should come back to on a full day at some point, because the long history of overlaps ideologically between a lot of the Western governments and the fascist and Nazi type governments is really underplayed. We often hear that they're an aberration, that they're evil, that we got into World War II to stop that evil. And everyone ignores the fact that Western governments were cheering on what was happening in Italy and Germany and had no problem at all until they started invading their neighbors.
Right.
It's just the geopolitics that was a problem. There's a significant overlap in imperialist rhetoric and racist rhetoric between the US and the Nazis. And it directly contradicts what groups like the Soviets were saying. So they were a shared ideological enemy. And we tended to, we put tons of former Nazis in charge in Germany. We tried a few top ones, and honestly, only because the Soviets were involved.
And look, we were recruiting German scientists at the time as well.
Yes. Operation Paperclip. Yeah, we brought thousands of scientists.
Absolutely. Scholars. And I think the narrative, you said something that was really interesting, that we got into the war. We didn't get into the war to defeat the Nazis. We got into the war because we were attacked in Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
Exactly. That caused our engagement, because otherwise Roosevelt wouldn't have engaged in World War II, because he was, for many years, Churchill was pleading with the U.S. to get involved, and it wasn't until the attack, the byproduct of engaging, was ultimately fighting the Germans. But the Germans were not beat by us. And correct me if I'm wrong, when they entered the Soviet Union to beat Stalin, I think, it was Stalin, right? They got caught in bad weather. And that was when the pushback started to happen. They couldn't because had it not been for the Soviet Union at the time, we could be speaking Deutschland language right now.
I mean, yeah, if anybody saw, there's been, what is it? The Man in the High Castle. This is a fun, like, alternate history.
Yes. I've seen episodes.
Yeah. We actually passed the anniversary very recently at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviets.
Yeah.
it kept the date for it kept slipping, and it was too late in the year, so they hit the rains and got ground down. But he was just like, no, they're going to collapse for us immediately. It's not just the weather. As they were moving in, the Soviets dismantled their industrial base and moved it to the other side of the Ural Mountains.
Ah,
It took them a few years to put things back together, but by 1943, they were cranking out the best tank of World War II. They were cranking out all kinds of stuff and could launch major counterattacks. But they just burned the food and moved the factories as the Germans were coming. And like, I don't know, bro should have learned this from like Napoleon. Napoleon got all the way to Moscow. Hitler never did. And the government had just abandoned it, said, fuck it, we're going to go somewhere else and we're going to keep fighting.
Yeah, I remember that. I do remember that. I think so. So it's a great, it's interesting. People don't realize, and I didn't know that we backed Nazis to suppress the partisans in Greece. So that's a good note
that
to
kind of stuff all over the place. Yeah, I mean, it was never about fascism per se. I mean, like hell, like Portugal and Spain had literally fascist governments, and we let them into NATO. I mean, that was never the problem. It was always specifically the geopolitics of it. It was the invasion of neighbors. It's the way it affects like the international trade systems and everything else. It's a complicated question, but it's definitely one we could come back to on a whole day and talk about those links, because if we're ever really going to turn a corner, like really, I don't know, become the good guys we could be, we're gonna have to face what we have done. And this is a start to that. If we're talking about the foreign policy stuff, it was one of the reasons I was actually really happy to see somebody like Reed, again, a fairly establishment figure, calling this out and saying this is the cause for this. The 53 coup, the way they worked it was by manipulating the internal political system. They created a ton of fear around potentially subversive leftist elements, which is been used in a lot of places. Like, it's how the Ba'athist government got in power in Syria. They just said, "Oh, if we don't take over, the communists will take over." So it's like it's a justification, right?
Right.
They what they're doing is feeding into crowds, putting like agents provocateurs out there to like whip crowds up there, and then you get the crowds like chanting against the government, and then that's an excuse for the army to step in and crush crowds. And like, I mean, we turn to like, again, Axis sympathizers to put them in power, and we made a deal. Like Mohammed Reza Shah was told in advance, "Hey, bro, you're stuck with a constitution now. How'd you like to be an absolute dictator?" And he's like, "Yeah, okay, why not?" And that's what we created with him. So the Shah and conservative elements in the military collaborated directly with the CIA to turn on crowds, to crush things, to seize control of the government. Mossadegh ended up, being on trial. I mean, he defended himself at his trial so well that they couldn't kill him. They tried to, but he spent the rest of his life under house arrest. And the move from there, this is the part that's, I think, most important. And this is the part that gets left out when people do say, "Hey, what about that coup," right? Because what's missing for people there is the 25 years in between. In those 25 years, the CIA created SAVAK, the Iranian secret police, and that secret police would disappear people, torture people, throw people in prison for life without, just to cut down any kind of dissent there. There was suppression of leftists, suppression of ethnic groups, any kind of like, hey, we'd like some rights for Azeris or Iranians or Kurds or something. Nah, fuck that. Like crushing that kind of stuff. And you go right back to the system they had in the 1930s, where all the candidates for office are directly vetted by the Shah. The Majlis is a rubber stamp. It's an absolute dictatorship propped up by a CIA-trained secret police. And that is what people are resenting. It's the long-term interference. When you get to, and this still shows up in media, all that like "death to America" stuff that you get in the late 70s, early 80s from.
I've heard that. It's since 1979.
Oh my gosh! Oh, how can you say "death to America"? They're not talking about us. He's not talking about Americans.
Well, that's the context of Joanne Reed's comment. Why do they say it? Well, let's talk about Operation Ajax and the overthrow of the government.
25 years.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about SAVAK because it was a secret police notorious for surveillance, torture,
Yeah.
repression, and then under the authoritarianism in SAVAK, there was suppression of press and political parties.
Mhm.
They were heavily banned and censored. I think that's an important, and
Yeah.
it took on pro-Western and aligned closely with the U.S. at the time. So Iran became a major supplier and military power in the region. The Shah was seen as a pillar of U.S. strategy in
Right.
the Cold
We give
War.
them all kinds of weapons. I mean, okay, so you saw the original Top Gun film? We
I
saw
did.
Top Gun, right? Okay,
Yeah,
so
I do remember.
flying off the carriers, those F-14 Tomcats, like with
Yeah.
like, moving wings. Oh, that's great. Iran was one of very few countries that flew those. Right? We closely collaborated with them. We forget that like the when they started building their atomic program, like Bushehr, Western countries were involved. We were supplying them. We had no. Iran actually had one of the first fully automated factories in the world, like with the robots, like the Japanese were pioneering at the time. The Iranians had built one. They were trying to show, hey, we can do advanced tech stuff too. One of the problems is during that period, while there's a lot of technical achievements that Iran has continued to build on ever since, which is why it has such a significant lead in like science and engineering in the Middle East, but they still did not invest in rural areas, in agriculture, in fixing things. You still had people in the 1970s using medieval methods. So a lot of the country was still dirt poor. And what they saw was a government in Tehran that was out of touch with them, that was connected to the US and to US imperialism, Cold War shit there, and interest in all these flashy projects, but didn't really give a damn about them at all. And that's on top of the direct suppression of dissent, of newspapers, of education. I mean, hell, Mohammad Reza Shah literally banned atheism in universities. Like anything that could be seen as remotely subversive, that could lead to people criticizing the regime, had to be shut down in any way. And all of this creates the ferment that gives us the Iranian Revolution in 1978. And
yeah, so let's talk about that for a second.
Okay, cool. Yeah, the one just very simple point, right? Because we don't need to get too into the weeds on things like this, but I really want people to understand that it's not like just a religious rejection. It wasn't much of like jihadists or something like.
Right.
It was a broad coalition of communists, of center leftists, of liberals, of different ethnic groups here, of students, of like lower middle class, like shopkeepers, small business owners, the clerical class, tons of people, like, so like explicitly conservative elements. They were all united in hating the Shah, but it wasn't religious led. This is one of the things that people often miss too. While people like Khomeini were an inspiration because of his speeches, it wasn't because they were religious, it's because they were political. He actually was repeatedly jailed by the Shah in the 60s until they finally kicked him out of the country because he's like, bro, what the fuck? Why are you aligned with the US, with Israel? Why are you like doing all this shit here? Why are you like letting people starve to death while you're building factories? What is the problem here? Calling the government out. And it's the political stuff that was inspiring there. They did not, the religious did not manage to seize control of the revolution until 1983 in the context of the Iran-Iraq War, which we played a part in inspiring too in 1980. So it took them 5 years for it to become a religious government. The first president of post-revolutionary Iran was an explicit secularist. Bani Sadr actually tried to secure the release of hostages too when that happened, right? But all of our missteps along the way, when Carter sent in helicopters to try and like free them by force, it undermined Bani Sadr and helped the Khomeinists. One step after another like that ends up helping those reactionary religious elements and harming all of the liberal and leftist elements that were part of the revolution. Iran did not have to be the kind of country it is today. It is what it is because of Ajax in 53, B, 25 years of SAVAK and the Shah, and C, what did we do for the first 5 years of the Iranian revolution? How did we directly? We armed Iraq and let other European powers arm Iraq in a vicious invasion. And we didn't care when they were like launching chemical weapons at Iranian cities. We're like, sure, here's the elements to make more chemical weapons. You can totally do that, bro. Which we love to forget about now when we're like, oh, the
Of
WMDs.
course we do. Of course we do.
We helped to create that program because Iraq is a much smaller country invading a much larger one. So it turned to those kind of weapons with our support. This all plays into the hands of the clerical establishment that created the current government there. Iran has the government it has now directly because of us. Mm. And that is really not understood well.
So my takeaway here is economic inequality leading to the revolution, political repression, corruption, and westernization. And we talked about that quite a bit. And ultimately causing the flee of the Shah in early 1979. And then the monarchy was abolished in February of 79. I think the timeline seems interesting. U.S. involvement, a debacle with the country.
US involvement
so U.S. involvement leads to a debacle in what could have been a prosperous country had we not gotten involved.
Right. If we had never gotten involved, if we left it the hell alone in the 50s. But even there, once they overthrew the government, if we had, instead of reacting to like, oh my gosh, you overthrew our pet dictator, now we have to like hate you forever. Like if we had just left that alone too, Iran might have picked itself back up. And realistically, you can see this in tons of socioeconomic and cultural areas. Iranians are significantly more secular than a lot of our allies among the Gulf Arab states, and have a considerably better education system. Still today, under the Islamic Republic, women outnumber men in colleges. Right? It is developing consistently overall, but it keeps being hobbled somehow. Like we keep kneecapping them, and then we blame them for the problems that come about from that. You know, the early years of the revolution were bad enough, but we kept it up ever since. You know, remember the when we shot down the Iranian airliner?
I do remember that.
It was a USS Vincennes, you know, like in what 83, 84, something like that. Sometime early. We just like, oh look, there's a plane here. We'll shoot it down, and then we never apologized. We killed 200 some Iranian civilians, and then just said, "Meh, fuck it." Like we treat them like an enemy. And then we wonder why they chant death to America. They're talking about our government. They're talking about our policy, not you and me. Like people in Iran don't hate you and me. They hate our foreign policy, and they hate being a target of U.S. imperialism.
Yeah, this was July 3rd, 1988, when flight 655, 290 people on board.
Almost 300 people.
274 passengers and 16 crew members were killed by the USS Vincennes. Mistakenly shot down. And so here's the explanation, not that it justifies anything. So misidentification, it was an F-14 fighter. How in the hell do you mistake an F-14 fighter with a commercial airplane? I don't understand that. Despite the fact that it identified itself as a civilian flight. So two surface-to-air missiles were launched, striking the plane almost immediately. Not only do they they give you their call sign, who they are, civilian flight, then you launch two surface-to-air missiles thinking it's an F-14 fighter. At some point, you realize, well, this big-ass F-14 fighter can't maneuver around the surface-to-air missiles because there's a counterattack, right?
Yeah.
So here's the explanation for those of you interested. So the crew reportedly issued radio warnings on both civilian and military frequencies. Sounds like the USS Liberty to me in Israel. Though Iran claims none were heard, the U.S. categorized the incident as a tragic mistake, and amid war conditions in 1996 paid $61 million in ex gratia compensation with no admission of legal liability. Like money's going to reconcile what they did. So again, the UN Security Council issued Resolution 616 expressing deep distress over the attack, while the U.S. expressed regret. It never issued a formal apology.
Right. That stuff matters. And this is the thing that gets me to, and honestly, even thinking of it in terms of like it's wartime, that's the last year of the Iran-Iraq war. And the last couple of years, there's almost nothing going on there. It's not a huge threat.
But
It's
what
not
war
like,
were we involved in? I mean,
and
were
we
we
weren't even
controlling the
technically a
airspace?
combatant. We were not
Yes.
a combatant in this war. We just keep our ships floating around in that area. We had no business doing this. And yeah, you're right. Like when they fired and it doesn't maneuver or drop chaff or anything else, they could have hit a board. They could have blown their own missile, but they didn't. We shot it down. And it's one thing to make a mistake and a tragic mistake. But when you can't say, I'm sorry, we fucked up, we're sorry. Those simple words kind of matter. And if you want to talk about why people are resentful, it's never getting that. This is true in anything.
Yeah.
Just imagine any human relationship, and you're arguing with people, and there's never any resolution. There's never any like apology. No one ever admits they did anything wrong. If somebody can never admit they did something wrong, that's a toxic situation.
That's an ego. It's an ego you
It is.
can't tame.
An imperialist ego is a problem. And this is what takes us to the current situation, because we have to treat Iran like an enemy. We have to treat Iran like a threat. I put up a little video a couple days ago, ranting about the supposed nuclear threat that Iran has posed, and the fact that it's entirely fictional. It's made up to scare us. It's made up because we need an enemy, and we have turned Iran into an enemy by our actions. And if we want to change the situation, if we want it to be better and not end up in situations like we just had and have right now, I mean, okay, since we recorded last time, we bombed Iran, so we should at least make some mention of that.
We will, and I do, because I think it's gonna. There's a period in this timeline that I think is important to mention, and I've heard it on a couple of different conversations, and it is the U.S. support of the Shah and giving him medical treatment, even though he was unpopular to widespread
and
corruption.
Letting him seize a bunch of money. He robbed the hell out of it. He stole everything that wasn't bolted down and flew out with him.
Right, and the result of that is a fear from various students, the revolutionary students, who ultimately feared the U.S. plotting another coup, right, or overthrowing the Islamic Republic, and then storming the embassy preemptively to take hostages. And
which we then play into by sending in troops.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit. So the U.S. embassy at the time was seen as the den of spies by the revolutionary students, and
which,
a symbol of
all embassies are. That actually goes back to the Middle Ages. Ambassadors have always spied on the local political conditions and reported. That's part of their job description. But yeah, there's specific resentment because, again, it was the CIA training SAVAK and propping up the Shah with tons of like money and weapons.
Yep, and so ultimately they take over the embassy, take 52 hostages under Jimmy Carter, which led to the humiliation of the U.S. Well, you reap what you sow. It cemented the Khomeini's power as he used the crisis to marginalize opposition.
Right.
So let's talk about that and galvanize revolutionary fervor.
Think about the flight in the first place, right? So here you have a government that, and honestly, both of the Pahlavi Shahs are guilty of this. They maintained a lot of the same corruption that you saw in the late Qajar period under people like okay, so how do I put this? The Shah of Iran was the richest person in the Middle East by far. They were fabulously freaking rich. Why? Because they were directly seizing the kind of profits in the same way the Qajar had done earlier to themselves, seizing everything and acquiring it for themselves. And when the revolution happened in 78, and at the beginning of 79, he decides, I'm going to take a vacation, never formally abdicated, just got on the plane, said, I'm leaving and I'll be back, and flew away with all the money. And he took just hundreds of millions took tons of cash with him. And the new Iranian government, as is their right, asked for the money back because he took money that was the government's money. Like it was the state's money that he just got to use because he was a Shah or whatever, but he seized it for himself and took it. and we gave him refuge and said, "Yeah, bro, you can totally put your money in our banks and you're safe here and everything is good." And they fought for years to get that stuff back. In addition, we froze tons of assets. I still see this today.
12 billion dollars to be exact.
Obama gave them a bunch of money. Like, no, we didn't give them money. We finally gave them back their own freaking money.
By the way, it was $12 billion that was frozen in December and November of '79.
Yeah, we seized their assets and we sat on them. That was their money, and we stole it. And then people are complaining today that we finally started giving it back. Like, are you kidding me?
Yeah,
it wasn't ours to begin with. But the seizure there creates a lot of resentment, because here you have this government was imposed by the U.S. in a coup, oppressed the living shit out of Iranians for 25 years. And when they finally rose up and toppled him, we're like, no, we want the dictator back. We're going to support the dictator. We're going to let him seize on the money, and we're just going to like cut your government off.
Right.
We manufactured an enemy out of nothing. And again, if you go back into the 30s and 40s, Iranians freaking loved us. And honestly, in popular culture, most Iranians still do. They don't have a problem with us culturally. They have a problem with our foreign policy.
I think many countries have a problem with our foreign policy, not just Iran.
Yeah, even our allies, poll after poll among our own allies say that we're the biggest threat to world peace, and that's kind of borne out by the last 80 years, which is upsetting to say the least.
It is, and I do want to go through the timeline, because you're right. They allowed the Shah to keep his assets, but froze Iranians $12 billion, and then there was an attempt to release the hostages. It was called Eagle Claw, which failed miserably, and there was a deadly helicopter crash due to mechanical failures. And at the time, 8 American servicemen died. And I remember this. I was in middle school at the time, very distinctly, especially with the hearings with Colonel Oliver North and his involvement. But ultimately, there was a release of the hostages once Reagan was sworn in the inauguration. The assets were removed. I mean, the sanctions were removed. So U.S. sanctions support Iraq during the the U.S. cut formal ties with Iran. The Swiss embassy in Tehran now handles U.S. interests. I want to see if the sanctions were removed or not.
Since, and that's again feeding the resentment. It's similar to, okay, so a lot of things have improved in socioeconomic terms in Cuba relative to where it was before the '59 revolution.
Right.
But many other things are problematic. It is effectively a police state. It does suppress dissent. But that government is still more popular than any alternative among a lot of people there, specifically because the U.S. has spent so much time isolating them and deliberately harming them because it doesn't like the government. If you don't like a government, cool, that's one thing. But if your policies directly harm ordinary people, you get them to be bigger fans of that government. It's just like we saw with like the sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s strengthened Saddam. I mean, those kind of policies, and quite frankly, this is one of the things that is hardest about the kind of privileged blindness we have to the impact of U.S. imperialism, is that we manufacture these enemies deliberately. It's advantageous to have that kind of anger in a few places that we can do without, because it then justifies so many other positions we'll take. We can talk about the nebulous communist threat, the nebulous Muslim threat. We can use it to justify other actions if we have a few of these enemies scattered around. So, yeah, all of this played into, and again, the one of the things that bothers me the most, thinking about your timeline stuff too, is just how much of the current repressive structure of the Iranian government came about because of our interference and sabotaging them in the first 5 years of the revolution.
Yeah. And I do want to take a step, just for those that are interested. The Algiers Accord that was signed in 1981, January 19th, was the catalyst behind the exchange. So removing the freeze on the assets for the Iranian government and then releasing the hostages. Now, I do want to come back to that timeline.
Just a second. You mentioned Reagan. Oh, gosh. At the risk of a can of worms here. It is worth pointing out that there are admissions of high level talks between the Reagan campaign and the Khomeinists, telling them, you'll get a better deal with Reagan, hold the hostages.
Well, talk about that for a little bit. So let's talk about Oliver North's involvement and how is that? Um, I do so actually pause on that note because I do want to mention something.
Yeah.
Because I do want to go back to that timeline. But there's something that's interesting I want to mention, and we talked about this last week, that Iran's economy, because of the sanctions, has been diversified, and their GDP has growth from various sectors. And I want to talk about that for a moment, and then I want to come back to your point here. So for those interested, so we know that $6 billion were released under Biden. That was money that belonged to the Iranians that was sanctioned. The U.S., the narrative, and I think by now, hopefully people understand that wasn't money we gave them. That was money we unfroze. The hydrocarbon sector accounts for about 25 to 30% of their GDP. And Iran's the second largest natural gas and fourth largest oil reserve holder. So oil production is approximately 3.3 million barrels per day, which exports around 1.7 barrels per day, right? And it goes primarily to China. Second source of revenue for their GDP stems from industry and manufacturing, including mining, construction, heavy industry, and accounts for 30 to 35% of their GDP. Manufacturing includes petrochemicals, construction, cement, which is a significant part of their construction sector, and it's worth about 38 billion annually. Services represent around 40 to 55% of their GDP, which is banking, trade, retail, public administration.
Right.
The most dominant in the financial sector is heavily state influenced. Agriculture, small percentage, about 5 to 10% of their GDP. Bonyads, charitable foundations, these semi-state organizations control about 20% of their GDP, heavily involved in manufacturing, trading, and real estate. So here's some challenges that if you'd like to know. So estimated nominal GDP in 2023 was about $4 billion. And it slipped below that in 2025, by the way. Growth is around 3.3 to 3.7 in 2024. And that's not a bad GDP growth, by the way. Right. It's not negative. And with the industrial sector growing nearly 45%, and I think ours was around 2.5% GDP growth. Inflation, persistently high. So inflation numbers, if you thought our inflation numbers were high, listen to this, 35 to 40% inflation numbers.
Yeah.
And food soaring to 70% last year.
Yeah.
That is wild. And finally,
that stuff is driven significantly by the sanctions and by the isolation of their economy.
Good point.
Remarkable about it, and you mentioned how far agriculture has fallen in terms of its contribution to the economy. It means they have effectively modernized their economy without participation in a lot of like U.S.-led stuff, and with persistent isolation and sanctions. And Europeans cut them off in many ways too, not to the same degree, but there's a lot of problems that have gotten in the way, and they still have managed to do all right. But it is still overall a poor country.
It is. And so their Iranian rial has depreciated over 50% in 6 months. So compounding inflationary periods and pressures. So this is what you talked about, Liam, the key obstacles, right? Sanctions, restricted oil exports, foreign investment, access to international financial systems. Their energy crisis, despite abundant reserves, frequent blackouts, and aging infrastructure, have forced shutdowns as a result of is sanctions, right? State control and corruption,
money, and difficulty of getting components, all kinds of things. I mean, they've actually they kept a lot of those F-14s flying for a long time with like Scotch tape and peanut butter. I mean, they just didn't have the resources, and they were cut off from the ability to service a lot of that kind of stuff. Honestly, their entire nuclear program is in part a way of continuing to build on the history of like science and engineering development there. And going and finishing the reactor that got started in the 70s got that whole project going. And the idea is like it's trying to build up that industrial and economic base inside the country with some of those projects.
Yeah. And finally, I think rising poverty and unemployment. Around 50% of young adult men are not in the workforce. They have food insecurity and poverty have surged. So that's kind of a little background on their economy. And so now we can kind of move forward a little bit.
Oh,
You talked
yeah,
about
you
the
went to the
hostage.
north, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, very, very short one on this because this is a kind of a complicated issue there. But our close ties under the table with the Islamic Republic in the 1980s, we were happy to sell them weapons. In fact, we illegally gave them weapons out of the U.S. arsenal, like TOW missiles for anti-tank missiles for the
Mhm.
during the uh, Iran-Iraq war, and we're funneling equipment to them in part because of that deal that the Reagan campaign had made that made it advantageous, and then we needed something we could do under the table because we had been funding a far right terrorist movement in Latin America, the Contras that were attacking the Nicaraguan government. And when
Right.
Congress finally said, "Bro, these guys are like blowing up health clinics and killing nuns and stuff. We can't support this anymore," and try to cut Reagan off from it. Reagan wanted to keep supporting that, so he started illegally funneling weapons to Iran and using the cash generated there to pick up like old, Soviet bloc weapons and give those to the
The,
Nicaraguan
the,
terrorists.
the U.S. government has its hand in every cookie jar, man.
Yeah, it's problematic, but again, that is another thing that still stands out to a lot of people there. So even under their current government, they've continued to find themselves in really weird situations like that where they're basically playing a part in US imperialism, and a lot of Iranians are deeply resentful of this. And the reason for a lot of what popular support the nuclear program does have is often tied to a sense of independence,
Hmm.
that they can do things themselves. They have a space program, like they can launch animals into space already. It's a poor country, but they're trying to find some pride despite the situation they're in. And people pick different sectors. Again, think about the Cuba example. Their healthcare system is phenomenal for a country that's that poor, but it's what they invest in, and it becomes a source of pride that they can like train and export physicians around the world to help with health crises, even though they're
Yeah.
poor. Iran takes a lot of pride in its scientific achievements. And this is where there's a significant amount of resentment too, because anybody who's outside of our system, but also is achieving anything, can be seen as a threat. Look at the
Yeah.
way that we turn so hard on the Soviet stuff. You still run into people over and over again today that are like, the socialist economics failed, communism failed, it produced a poor country. Like it empirically did not. The economic system worked. That it worked created a political problem, and the
Right.
political problem, the geopolitics of it created a very authoritarian state trying to prop it up. But the economics wasn't ever the issue, and certainly not the science and engineering part. You don't need a Wall Street to do significant scientific and industrial research.
No.
The
No.
Soviets the Soviets built the first space stations. They had the first
Well,
satellites. They built the largest aircraft in world history. But that was a threat. So you have to isolate those things. You have to tell people there is no alternative. There's only the Washington consensus. Everything that isn't what we want is bad. So there's no competition of any sort. And Iran is another type of competitor there because because of the amount of resentment about the imperialism part. So their desire to go their own way and do their own thing.
right. I find it interesting that a country that's been sanctioned, whose inflation numbers are egregious, whose economy and cost of living has been virtually destroyed, I think, just based on what we're seeing,
Yeah.
yet can go toe to toe with a country that gets $3.8 billion a year from the U.S. and
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
is one of the largest militaries in the Middle East. And
The
so Matt, so I think that aligns with the existential threat. This is a country had they not had the sanctions would be the probably the strongest country in the Middle East, right?
What was it? Was what was it
I
strongest?
was saying that imagine had they not had the sanctions,
Oh God, yeah.
what
That,
what
that
kind of what kind of power they would, what kind of government they would
that's the
be.
whole point.
Yeah,
If you look at the size of the population, if you look at the diversification of the economy, if you look at the knowledge base that they built there, they
right.
would be a major player in the world
Yeah,
if they weren't held back. And that's honestly the
that
goal and things like that. It lies behind a lot of the opposition we've had to say economic development in China and other places. Like if there's anything that could become a potential threat to economic dominance or to regional dominance, like the Iranians want a seat at the table.
yeah,
When we talk about them as like some kind of military threat, Iran hasn't invaded another country since the 18th century.
no, they haven't.
So they're not a military threat. What they want is a seat at the table commensurate with their economy and their
Yeah,
population. They want to be a player. They want to be heard, and instead they're isolated, and that
yeah,
builds a kind of resentment that is going to feed hard right or reactionary elements. U.S. policy is actually calculated to keep reactionaries in power. Whenever a reformist is campaigning in Iran, whenever you get somebody like, hey, I want to like free things up here, I want to like calm things down, we turn hardcore against them because the religious establishment, the reactionaries,
yeah.
they're more useful. They help to maintain that isolation. They help to maintain our military posture in the area. We don't want them to reform.
Right. So, Liam, I want to pose this to you, and I hear this quite a bit as a nonsensical response. You said they haven't, you're right, they haven't invaded anybody since the 18th century, but then the counter argument to that as well, they're funding these proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas. Talk
Oh,
about how many proxies the Israeli government and the US government have funded over the years.
hello, yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Okay,
In addition to SAVAK, what else have they funded?
okay. So thinking about, oh God, the list of like
Give me the top three in from each country.
terror groups that we've supported, like the number of governments we've overthrown. Hell, just the year before Operation Ajax, or the year after, 54, we overthrew the government in Guatemala and put in power a far right dictatorship that ultimately contributed to a civil war and a genocide there. I mean, we have our fingers in pies all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's any kind of resentment of anybody else doing it. Like no
Right.
one else is allowed to do this. Like people like, oh my gosh, Russia interfered in our elections. Okay, cool. How many elections does the US interfere in? It doesn't justify what they're doing. Hello. It doesn't justify what they're doing in any way, but it's there's a hypocrisy to it that says we're
Absolutely.
entitled. Iran too, when we talk about this, and it's a problem with establishment media across the West, whether you're talking about European countries, Germany, Britain, the US, we all say Iran aligned militia or Iran allied terrorists or something. We use like something that always attaches Iran to it, even though all they're doing is supporting other movements for some kind of autonomy or dignity. The situation of like, okay, so they have armed the Houthis, but the Houthis are what, half of the population of Yemen and are historically persecuted by the Sunni populations around
Mm-hmm.
them and the imperialism around them and want some self-determination. They want, again, to be recognized, and to have a seat at the table. And Iran's the only player stepping up to do that. The Shia in Lebanon, we talk about Hezbollah, and again, no fan of groups like this, no fan whatsoever of Hezbollah, but they exist because of Israel's invasion of Lebanon and the
Yep.
occupation of the South, and B, that the constitutional order created in Lebanon by French imperialism and then later with U.S. support excluded Shia to a significant degree. They are the single largest demographic group in Lebanon, but constitutionally had no access to the presidency or the prime ministership. They were perpetually kept in third place at best, and people resented that. So it's what you end up with is Iran supporting these kind of resistance or revolutionary movements that are trying
Yeah.
to address a kind of wrong. It doesn't mean that they're a threat to us. Hezbollah is explicitly a Shia Lebanese nationalist movement. It has nothing to do with the U.S. Hezbollah is not going to go bomb New York City or Los Angeles. They don't give
No.
a shit about us. So it's not the same as like supporting the Islamic State or Al Qaeda or something there. Does it lead to civilian deaths? Sure. But so do all the militias we arm and support,
Well,
like the Contras.
well, here's one that I also want to share. So for those that always use that argument, well, you know, Hezbollah and Hamas are a proxy for Iran. Let me go through some timelines for those
Hamas is a proxy
that
for
don't know. So
20.
Israel became one of South Africa's main arms supplier between 1970 and 1980.
Mhm.
After the UN imposed a mandatory arms embargo in 1977.
Yep.
They sold anti-tank and air-to-air missiles, naval patrol boats, electronic warfare equipment. And in 2010, there was a declassification of South African documents from 1975 that indicated Israel offered to sell nuclear warheads to South Africa. Both governments denied the claim, but scholars consider the cooperation
Collaborated to develop them. Israel's
Yes.
only atomic tests, like live tests of a detonation, were on an island off the coast of South Africa.
Yep.
The
And so
nuclear program was in collaboration with apartheid South Africa, and we're all just like,
well, here's another one. You know, while South Africa faced increasing isolation, Israel maintained unofficial but close ties through defense attaches, trade envoys, and intelligence exchanges. Mossad and South African intelligence agencies reported shared counterinsurgency tactics, particularly regarding Palestinian and African liberation movements.
Yep.
Economic and trade ties for those of you. So your argument too, they fund this. South Africa exported uranium and industrial diamonds and raw materials to Israel. Israel exported military technology, agricultural equipment, and communications gear. Joint ventures existed in arms manufacturing, aerospace, and other sectors, just to name a few of the things. And so every country has funded a proxy. It doesn't mean
it's not unusual. And all
Yes.
major powers have done it. This is one of the things that blows me away so much about the way we teach history, right? Because unambiguously, Nazi Germany, evil government,
Absolutely.
horrific atrocities. But why do we put them in a separate category from the British Empire?
Yeah.
Why is that okay? I mean, the death toll of the British Empire is horrifying. You're talking about hundreds of millions of deaths from starvation, disease, underdevelopment, direct massacres, genocides all over the world. And we separate that entirely because they're the good guy. The way we frame things really matters. So the framing on Iran makes them the bad guy because that's useful to us. The framing on Britain makes them a good guy because that's useful to us, but more specifically, useful to the government and the business classes. It doesn't help us. It puts Americans on the line. It puts Americans at risk.
Yeah, and I think I bring that up to say this. Just because a government like the US, like the UK, like Israel, like Iran has funded a proxy, it doesn't mean another country has the right to flip the regime. It's up to the people to do such things.
Yeah.
And so that's why I bring up that point. When I hear that argument, oftentimes I'm like, wait a minute, you think Iran is the only one that's funded a proxy? Have you not heard about what the US has done, what other Western governments have done?
If we think about the logic of that, if we take them seriously on that, right? If you take people's rhetoric about proxies and all these different resistance or terror movements seriously, then what you're doing is you're justifying 9/11.
Yeah.
What you're doing is you're justifying the attacks on like the USS Cole or things like that. You're saying that's okay. The embassy bombings in East Africa and in Tanzania, whatever. You're saying that's okay because they we're a legitimate target. No, we're not. That's not how it's supposed to work. You're not supposed to say a government has the right to like attack other countries that way because of these or hurt civilians, bomb civilians because of this stuff. There was you remember the bombing of the disco in Berlin that led to Reagan bombing Libya?
I think so, vaguely.
There was a bomb there. Some service members were killed, right? The evidence was really kind of sketchy, but some of it tied back to like Gaddafi, and they're like, hey, we're just going to go bomb the hell out of Libya there. We killed a shitload of civilians, including one of Gaddafi's children over that, right?
Yeah.
It's when you're talking about these different militant movements in different places, that kind of secret intelligence, it's never supposed to affect civilian lives. And
Yeah.
what realistically is the difference between a government sending in jets and bombing apartment buildings or terrorists planting a bomb in an apartment building? People are still murdered.
Mm-hmm.
We
It's the
treat
tactic.
governments like it's totally okay that they
Yeah.
do it.
Because there's some sort of strategy behind it.
Yeah,
I
strategy, interest, or whatever, or really, there's a sense of like worshiping the state as an entity that basically frees individuals of accountability. If
Yeah.
non-state actor, then it's ordinary people getting together in their basement and planning something here. But if it's a government, oh, the government did it. The people who wrote the orders didn't do it.
Right. It's the difference between a living room and a situation room.
Right. And what is the difference in terms of the impact on people? What is the difference in terms of like the resentment that builds up? You think about a lot of the Islamophobia that's been mined in this country for decades. Yeah. You can tie it to things like 9/11.
And I think we need to be
around and think about what happens in countries around the world that we've bombed. Every time you bomb something, you're creating more radicals who are going to hate your government.
Agreed. I want to be clear. I want to be clear on this. Look, we're not in favor of any government that oppresses their people, that destroys economic vitality for their people, that destroys the ability to grow. We're not advocating for that. We're just saying, why is it that powers like the U.S., the U.K. think that they can flip a regime at the at a turn of a page? That is not that. As a result of them trying to, when they couped the government, when they helped with the coup of the government in Operation Ajax, ultimately leading us to where we are today. And so, God knows, look, hindsight, right? What if none of that happened? Would we be in this situation today? And so, which brings me to my next question, Liam. So, B-52 bombers, stealth bombers, dropped on the 3 uranium sites. I don't think there's any evidence of what was destroyed, right?
Oh, that's a funny one. Like our own military's studies of it, as well as Iran's reports and some of our allies' reports on it, are all saying minimal damage. The uranium stores weren't touched, right? They can rebuild centrifuges, like, and we're just like, oh yeah, it's total success. And what we're doing is it's like our government contradicting our own intelligence reports.
Oh my God, how much that's been happening lately.
More effective than we set it back by months.
Yeah, which to me is okay. This so-called 12-day war takes the eye off the ball, which is Gaza, who continues to have
Yahoo's corruption scandals too. Now now there's a little scratching each other's back bit. Now Trump is trying to pressure the Knesset to drop the corruption charges and investigation against Netanyahu. Like, hey, it's a witch hunt. It's just like when they went after me. Yeah, no, the dude's corrupt as fuck.
Yeah, so drop B-52 bombers. We'll do it for you. And here, so Gaza's still uninhabitable. I heard a story the other day on a live, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention this story. So a content creator that I know very well went to the 8 sites, and this is how desperate it's gotten in Gaza as a result of what the IDF is doing in the Israeli government. He goes to get aid. He gets stabbed by another Palestinian because of the difficulty in getting aid for family. They've caused them to turn. They've caused the Palestinians to turn against each other.
Yeah.
Luckily, he's still alive. So this evil government has created an environment that's unlivable. That seems like the Hunger Games. Worse than that,
for sure,
causing people to turn on each other. And all this time, people have been focused on Iran, U.S., and Israel, and nothing has changed in Gaza.
Yeah.
And so, I think as a community, we need, and I've seen this on social media. We are bandwagon content creators. What's active now is where we want to have a discussion, or what's popular now. And look, I'm not blaming any content creator for doing this. I think it's important to inform people I'm not saying that content creators are bad. Is that you can do both things. You can do this and this. And
Yeah.
someone asked me the other day, like, hey, you stopped doing the Arabic word of the day, you know? Why did you do that? Like, hey, because I just felt uncomfortable saying, hey, don't scroll past this. It's your time for your Arabic word or phrase of the day while people are dying. Because I put a smile on my face when I do those things. And I can't smile and do that. Like I'm teaching you Arabic, but yet people are dying for food.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to do something different that's more educational, but like we can't forget what's happening. And I don't know when this will end. I have no timeline, and I don't think anybody does other than the Israeli government and the US. Um,
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's the thing. There is no ending to it, and it's why you need distractions. Um, at the end of the day, a lot of geopolitics among great powers involves like the dog and pony show sort of thing. It's like
Yeah.
look at that, and it distracts us from the awful shit that's happening. You know that we're responsible for. And I mean, God, anybody who's studied the Holocaust and cares about that, looking at the way people are queuing up for aid in Gaza and the way that they're treated, it's insane. Like it's the you've lost something of your humanity when you're not
Mm.
able to deal with that. But we've spent so much time demonizing the Muslim world and creating useful enemies in the area that it's very easy for people to say, like, yeah, they're just evil people. You should glass the whole strip and, kill them
It's
all.
disgusting.
Otherwise, it'll never stop. And what you're doing is victim blaming.
Yeah.
And this, again, you made a point earlier about governments. Okay. And I want to make clear, I'm not a fan of the current Iranian government. I wouldn't mind if it got significantly changed or overthrown. But foreign wars to do that, regime change wars, that doesn't make anything better. That makes
exactly.
it consistently every time it happens. It doesn't, there's no pretext for that. The Iranian people have a right to do that.
Yeah.
But when we talk about Iranians and their situation there, we talk about the economic situation for them, the loss of rights there. That's our fault. We continue to support the hard right elements there that keep that government awful for people because it's useful for us. In the same way that Netanyahu helped to fund Hamas because it was useful to have an enemy as a counterbalance against the PLO and blah, 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 and keep them fighting each other. If Palestinians fight each other, then it's easy. Because if Palestinians united politically and then had massive sit-ins and you had 5 million people just sit down in the streets and just block every street in Israel, it would get attention around the world and you wouldn't be able to say, look, they're terrorists. You wouldn't be able to attack them. If they're fighting each other and there's violence there, you can say, oh, look, they're savages, blah, 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 and play into all that imperialist rhetoric, all that racist rhetoric. It's advantageous to do that. We directly support the mullahs in Iran, and then we blame them for the problem. It's victim blaming bullshit that supports global empire.
Yeah, and I don't want to lose sight of the fact there were alliances in the 20s and leading up to the first Intifada that were nonviolent in nature and protests, boycotts,
absolutely
among Palestinians. But then power became the principle versus principle becoming the power, right? And so I think that's
you have to stop that. So if people are going to organize nonviolently, you have to hit them as much force as you can early on so you get people to throw things back, and then you can say, look, they're violent, and then it's again that dog and pony show. Look at that, look at the terrorists, and you ignore the weeks of protest before that point, and you ignore the oppression that leads to it. It's the same situation we have in Iran. If you ignore the context, then you can paint this simple picture of an enemy. Oh, the Iranians just hate us, they're irrational or whatever. That's bullshit. Cause and effect works in human relations. You can see why this happens. If we ignore the gun we've put to their head just to look at them shooting back, then you'll never understand it and we'll never stop it.
I also blame not seeing the true picture on the Western media because it's been portrayed completely different for decades.
Yeah.
But in the last 2 years, the narrative has changed. It just hasn't.
The term you raised earlier.
Yeah.
There's a sense of imperial privilege in that, and we're privileged to be ignorant. Yeah. We don't face direct consequences for
Right.
the ignorance that we allow. So it doesn't matter. People just feel that they can get away with this. They can fall back on these simplistic racist narratives and not pay attention to what's really happening, but other people suffer for it.
Absolutely. So, which brings me to our final topic, and we've got about 10 minutes here. So, I shared with you before we started recording something that happened to me this past week.
Mhm.
So, I joined a content creators live in the spirit of sharing information, nothing more, nothing less. And right before I got up there, they had someone who bought and flipped homes. And I shared a little background. Hey, I've been doing this for this many years, no longer there. Share some statistics around financial literacy, how many people have so much money at the end of the month, how many people can answer so many questions about financial literacy. And then I talked about how many homes are left abandoned, and how what an important reminder for all of us, including me, to hey, beneficiaries, trust, things of that nature, to help. When bad situations happen, you're prepared for those, and part of it stems from the lack of financial literacy. Not to assume that anyone listening or on the panel lacks that ability, but when you've got, over 60% can't answer 4 out of 5 financial literacy questions, let's just say 500 people in the room, there's about 300 people that don't, right? That's 60%. And so I shared the information and didn't think anything of it. And I'm pretty open to feedback. If someone wants to give me direct feedback, I'm totally cool with that. I've gotten better at receiving it. One of the mods comes up and says, "Yeah, I got something to say about you're talking from a place of privilege, and we tend to do that." I didn't understand what we meant at the time. I think they said we. I assume she uh, you know put me in a category of white passing because, like I said, on the census and any demographic questions, MENA is not always there. Middle East, North African, it's always I have to select white. But I know that if I say I'm white, then it's denying the cultural identity of a Palestinian, right? My race is Arab. I'm Palestinian ethnicity. I'm not lumped into that category by choice. I'm forced because there's no legislation that forces uh, companies to say Middle Eastern or anything else. I apologize. Look, if I didn't come up here to thinking I was coming from a place of privilege, it was only more information than anything else. My question to you is how could that have been, and they were talking about classism, racism, and a couple other topics. So how could that have been approached differently by me if it could have been? And if not, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a tough one because there are genuine places where being sensitive to like long histories of oppression, classism, racism, things like that do require us to work through or set aside certain privileges. And a lot of people can be very prickly about that too. You raise the specter of like white privilege for a lot of people, and they're like, that doesn't exist. Oh, there's no such thing as white privilege. I had to work to get where I am. Like, okay, cool. But you started off in a different position in terms of how society relates to you. You
Right.
have been poor, but your poverty wasn't exacerbated by people treating you different because of how you look or how you
Mm.
sound. Those are different things.
Right.
Privilege isn't just about money. And that comes up a lot in discussions like this, where we think about it in terms of money or education or something. Hell, I run into places like this where they talk about the sense of privilege that I have. Okay, I'm an academic. I have lots of books, blah, 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 all that kind of crap. So, oh, I must be privileged or something. I have $350,000 in debt. I have a negative net worth, and I'm going to die with a negative net worth because it's hard to go to graduate school when you're. I didn't start college till I was 30.
Right.
Not financial. My privilege isn't financial. I'm privileged to be able to study certain things and to have certain knowledge, which you're talking about with financial knowledge, and I'm privileged by the way people will treat me because of how I look, because
Mm.
I'm a, again, quote unquote, white male, whatever, like I'm going to be seen in a particular way. And that does
Right.
affect certain conversations, and we should be sensitive to those.
Mm.
At the same time, I think there can be at times a kind of oversensitivity to some bits of it that actually shuts things out, that stops us. The financial literacy is an interesting one, and I like raising this one specifically in the context of like classist or like economic type discussions.
Yeah.
Um, and it's one I can relate to again because I don't make a whole lot of money for how much debt I have. But I mean, Karl fucking Marx played the London Stock Exchange. It's not like it's not like financial literacy hurts your ability to do other things.
Right.
So you got to survive. You live in a system. We all are in a precarious situation here. Half of Americans can't afford a $500 emergency. They're stuck. You're barely making it. And when things are that bad, anything we can do that helps a little bit. So somebody hearing you, you're talking about financial literacy, how to set up different investment accounts, how to save,
Right.
set up trust, anything else. Anything that you're saying, somebody can look at that and say, you know what? I can't do that right now because I don't make enough money, but I can still learn. And if I do, I can take advantage of this, or somebody else could, or maybe I could work with other people and we could pool some resources. And it's still useful information. People will tend sometimes to shut it out because they think that it's sort of like devaluing them. Oh,
Yeah.
I'm poorer. You're talking from a position where people have money, I don't, therefore you're
Right.
talking down to me. And I
Mm.
get the same thing too on educational levels or whatever. You're talking
Right.
down to me. You're somehow isolated or cut off from a real working class experience or something. Those kind
Mm.
of things, they stop us from more effectively organizing and changing the world for the better.
Mm.
We all can do better off if we're helping each other out, if we're sharing knowledge, if we're contributing. And financial literacy is an issue. We can all stand to gain more from that.
Yeah, and I think for me, what I didn't want happen after that discussion is for me to suppress the education. I'm like, okay, I can't stop helping. That's just not who I am. But I also have to recognize the. I have to read the room. I have to recognize the situation and know the approach. Because the last thing I want to do is offend anybody. If the intention was to be supportive or helpful, I definitely don't want to suppress what I'm teaching if I have an opportunity to teach. Because believe it or not, that demand in various communities where I live, especially in low to moderate income communities and continuation schools, quite frankly, regular high schools it's in demand. But I need to also recognize the platform and where I'm sharing the information so that people don't
Oh,
feel
there's a
offended by it.
there's a point that's come out to me a lot, that I think I can really relate to what you're talking about here. There's in terms of reading the room, there's a kind of sensitivity that does help. On the one hand, you can say, okay, maybe somebody's being a little too prickly about this, and we're just trying to help each other here. But pushing back against that can be alienating. There's a certain sensitivity that we at least need. And sometimes, like, okay,
Yeah.
so I might walk into a conversation and, I don't know, maybe I've studied a lot about like race or sexism or this or that here, and I want to share some stuff. But there are times when I need to step aside and I need to elevate other voices, and I need
Yeah.
not to try and push my way into something. You can
Sure.
offer something and you can contribute to conversations without steamrolling people, I suppose. And I think
Yeah.
one way to get over, or at least that helps with the kind of sensitivity that people can have, the sense that, oh, you're coming in here with your privilege and talking to me. Well, if you're
Right.
sensitive to them as well, if you're respectful and you help try to amplify their voices, you're suddenly not a threat. It
Yeah.
doesn't tar you as the bad guy. And over time, we all can learn from each other.
Absolutely. And I think I think back, I think, the other thing that can be done differently is for me is like, walk into those environments. I truly oftentimes is just listen in the chats. I'll step in about 20 minutes, and if there's something I can add, I will. If there's nothing I can add, I'm learning also. I think if I don't need to see it as a way to add something more, to come from a place of curiosity and ask questions when I get into those platforms. Because the last thing I want to sound is preachy, right? And however I may think whatever I may think about people's oversensitivity, that's their lived reality. And so where I may think it's oversensitivity, that's that's my problem, not theirs. And so why not come from a place of curiosity? Not Why not just listen? And I think to your point, continue to elevate their voices. That's a big takeaway. It it really stuck with me. I was talking to Summer about this, and I'm like, man, because I don't like being in those situations where people feel like I'm coming from a place of privilege or not being helpful. And I walked away thinking, let's have this discussion because people are probably thinking that also on different platforms. So thank you for engaging in it. So Liam, we're at 352, man. This has been amazing so far. Any closing comments for our folks?
Yeah, I think just to close the last one there, and I'll note that um, it can be difficult, and honestly, in plenty of topics, I run into all kinds of issues as like you know, I don't know, as a autistic nerd who just wants to talk about his special interest, I can get like in the mode, start talking about something, but then you have to like watch yourself or check yourself, take a step back, and sometimes like be, the collaborative, like help other people by elevating them, not trying to
Yeah.
like dominate a particular discussion there. There's uh a line I remember from there was a great folk singer, Utah Phillips, who used to just tour around and he would play like all these old songs from late 19th, early 20th century, and he would tell stories in between. And he's telling a story once about this his experience, his first encounter with like anarchism in like these flop houses in Utah, and uh, he's talking about how like pacifism and anarchism actually work as a lived reality, not as an ideology, as a way
Right.
to live, as a way to be. It's a matter of saying, here I am in 21st century United States. I was born armed to the teeth with weapons of privilege because I am male in a rich country and white, right?
All
I
right.
benefit from empire, even if it doesn't mean I'm in the millionaire class or some shit. I still have, there are benefits to that, which means that I have some responsibility to try and disarm myself from
Mm,
those weapons of privilege, to try and
absolutely.
elevate women's voices and minority voices, like the people who aren't being heard, to contribute where I can, but not to walk in as this, I don't know, white savior bullshit.
Yeah.
It's
Agreed.
there's a fine balancing act there, but I think
No,
it
I
requires a bit of sensitivity.
no, I appreciate the call out. It's a good discussion. Man, we had a great discussion today. A lot of topics. I'm glad we walked through that timeline. Um, and we just concluded episode 20. It is July. It is June what today? June 25th, 26th.
26, yeah, yeah. So this will be out on
God, man,
Monday.
how time flies. Guys, this will be published on Monday. YouTube, Podbean, Apple, Spotify, Amazon. Check us out. Let us know. Put your comments in. If you want to hear topics that are different than what we're talking about, please put them in the comment section. We want to hear from you. We're trying to make this as collaborative as possible in terms of topics. We want to hear from the audience. If you want guests to come in, let us know what type of guests you want. If you want more jokes from me, like dad jokes, let me know. I have one for you as we round this up. So, Liam, so you hurt your foot uh, during when you're walking. You what do you take to the emergency room?
What do I take to the emergency room?
Yeah, if you hurt your foot,
I don't know. Let me know.
a tow truck,
That's cute.
a tow truck. Guys, thank you so much for being with us today. Appreciate you all. Have a great rest of your week. Enjoy, and we will see you on the next episode. Take care.